So let's move on to the price input and add validation there as well. For that, I'll add the validator. Again, here we have that function which gets a value and should return a string or null. And now in here, we're validating the price. Now, what should be true about the price? Well, I want to check if it is empty, in which case it's certainly not valid. So in that case, I would return, please enter a price. But if we make it past this if check, it is not empty, but it still might be an invalid number. So here I want to check if double parse succeeds. Try parse is the perfect solution for that, because try parse, unlike parse, does not throw an error if it fails, but return null if it does fail. And therefore, if we compare this to null, and of course I try parsing my value, then we know that parsing failed, because try parse returns null if it fails. So then we could return, please enter a valid number, because now we know that the user did enter something, but it was not a valid number. Now maybe parsing succeeded, but the number is smaller or equal to 0, and of course a valid price should be above 0, or above any threshold you have. So then, I want to parse this. I know now that parsing will succeed because we made it past this check, which checks for invalid numbers. But here I want to parse the value and check if it's smaller or equal to 0. And of course, your threshold could also be 1, 100, whatever your minimum price is. You should just tell the user about your minimum price at some point. So here I would then return, please enter a number greater than 0, or anything like that. And if we make it past all these checks, I return null, because then we have a valid number. So with that, now here, if I hit save, this succeeds. If I enter nothing here, I get please enter a price. If I enter 0, I get please enter a number greater than 0. And if I enter hello, I get please enter a valid number. So we give the user various hints on what's wrong depending on what the user entered. Now let's move on to the description. There it's a bit simpler. I'll also add my validator, of course, get my value, my value. And you can name this argument however you want, of course. It's passed in automatically, but you're receiving it here, so you can name it however you want. And here I want to check if value is empty, in which case I return, please enter a description. And that's just an arbitrary condition I also came up with. I want to make sure that if it's not empty, the length is greater than 10, so that we have a description that is at least 10 characters long. Therefore, here the check should be if it's smaller than 10, because if it's smaller than 10, then I return should be at least 10 characters long, or anything like that. And if we make it past these checks, I just return. Null, I mean. So now with that, if we save this, we go back here, submitting this works. If I remove a couple of characters, now it's too short, and if I remove all characters, we get please enter a description. This is long enough, however, well, is indeed long enough, and we are able to submit it. Now, last but not least, for the image URL, you could come up with a complex validation using regular expressions, and after this lecture, I'll have a text lecture with more information about regular expressions. They're a bit more advanced, a bit more niche, but can be useful, therefore I have them in a separate lecture. Here, we'll add a quite basic validation to that image URL input. We can also add the validator argument and create our function here. Again, an anonymous function in my case here. And now in there, I'll have a relatively simple validation. I'll check if the value is empty. And if it is empty, I return my good old please enter an image URL message here. If it's not empty, it might still be invalid, because I want to check if the value starts with, and that's a method Dart provides on strings, if it starts with HTTP, or if the value starts with HTTPS, or to be precise, if it does not start with that. So if it does not start with HTTP, and it does not start with HTTPS, so neither of the two is correct, then I know this can't be a URL, so I'll return please enter a valid URL. If we make it past this, I return null, and of course you could still have a URL that does not yield an image, even if it is a valid URL. You could have a URL to google.com, which is not an image, but a web page. And in such cases, we still would have an invalid image. That's something we don't capture here. You could, of course, think about more elaborate rules where you also check whether the link ends with .jpeg or .png to improve the likelihood of that being an image. So actually, let's do that. So if the value does not end with .png and it also does not end with JPEG and also does not end with .jpeg with the E in there. So we have neither of these. Then let's say I know it's not a valid image. So then we could return, please enter a valid image URL. Of course, that's still not the perfect check. It leaves out some formats which you might want to accept in your application. And just because something ends with .jpeg also doesn't ensure it's necessarily an image, but it's good enough here. We have various checks now. And with that, we have that validation in place too. Now, one thing we could now also do is we could take these checks and bring them into our update image URL function here. And then when we have a changed focus here, we could add these checks, and instead of value, we could use the image URL controller text value, which is the value the user entered. And if this is empty, or this value, so image URL controller text, does not start with HTTPS, or concatenating these conditions as well, the value does not end with PNG or JPEG like this, then here we could just return and not continue. Because in the end, what I have here is a long check where I check whether this is empty, and if that is true, we return, or if it does not start with HTTP and not with HTTPS, so I'll wrap this into extra parentheses to make clear that these two belong together. If this condition overall is true, we also return. So if it's not starting with that, or here, these three are also making up one block altogether. So if that ends up being true, so if we don't end with one of these extensions here, then I also want to return. With that, I make sure that I don't show a preview if we have an incorrect URL. With that, let's go there. And if I now tap into a different input and I submit this seems to work. I get my output there. Now, if I remove .jpeg here at the end, like this, you see this preview doesn't update and we don't get an error. So our check here in update image URL seems to work. And if I submit, I get an error message here. Now, if I re-add .jpeg here and I tap somewhere else, then this is updated and I can now save this again. Now, if we then go all the way to the left here, and I remove HTTPS at the beginning, tap somewhere else, it's not updating the preview, and I get an error if I try to submit it. And if I now delete everything here, so select all the inputs there. So if I clear this entire input and I click somewhere else, again, this is not updated, which is good. Of course, you might say if it's empty, then maybe you want to clear this as well. But I get this error message here. And yeah, actually, if it is empty, I'll remove this check. If it is empty, then I don't want to return. Instead, I want to call setState and indeed update this preview with the enter a URL text. So with that, we added validation to all these inputs, which is great, which works as it should here now. The missing piece for adding a product now, of course, is that we do actually create a new product and add it to our product list, which we can see here once we're done editing here.